So, by the way, there's a law that says you have to have a plan. Administrative Code, Rule 15, says each owner shall adopt a policy. And it talks about who has to be part of that. It says that drivers have to understand the policy. And it even goes on to say, no school bus driver shall transport pupils unless they've been trained in your emergency plan. So we could say we have to do this because the law says. I'm saying to you, forget that. We need to do this to save our own bacon, right? Because it's going to happen. And we got to be ready for it. So what the law says is you have to include at least these things. Now you start looking at this and you're going to think, whoa, these aren't emergencies. These happen on a daily basis. Right? So, and I suspect that's true for a lot of you. Bus driver calls in and says, the bus quit. It won't go. Is there anyone in the room that hasn't had that radio call at least once? What's the first question you ask them? Well, what's the fuel gauge say? All right. But buses quit. Or a driver calls in and said, I just had a crash. And you kind of go into this automatic response mode. So there's a lot of things, if you've been doing this for a while, that you just do. And you're all very good at it. Right? It's the new people coming in saying, oh my gosh, what's going to happen if I have a bus crash? How do we do things in this district? Well, that's not the way I did it in the last district. Right? So we have to learn that stuff. What happens if a driver gets sick on a route? You kind of go into automatic response, right? Either you go out there or you send someone else out there in a car. Maybe you send a bus and a new driver. Maybe you just take a driver out, swap them out. Bad weather. What happens if the news says, okay, we're going to have a snowstorm rolling in at 3 o'clock in the morning? You reset your alarm for a little bit earlier in the day, right? You get up and you check things. Then you call the superintendent. If you're smart, you throw a snowball or two on his front steps so that when he looks out, he realizes it's bad. Right? But we do those things on a regular basis. We know what to do. So these things have to be included in the plan. I've been in some districts where this is part of the driver's handbook. I think that's okay. I'm personally more of an advocate of having a separate manual that deals with your emergency plans. And the reason why is twofold. One is sometimes driver handbooks end up being part of negotiations, which means if something changes, it's really hard to fix. The second thing is that in emergency planning, all plans have to be flexible. Stuff changes. And so we need to be able to edit, update, and republish on a regular basis. So those things have to be included. Here's the real problem, is that when you stop to think about some of the pictures I've shown you and some of the things that could happen in your district, you quickly realize that there's a whole lot more there than I can fix in one afternoon at my desk. So let me say this to you. It's an adage that I used to use as a trainer in our fire department. If you think about this whole thing as an elephant, knowing that we have to eat it, you got to eat it one bite at a time. If you look at this elephant and say, man, I need to solve this thing before Monday next week, you won't get it done. Right? It's too stressful. There's just too much to do. And if you come up with something, it won't be as good as if you did it carefully, a step at a time. So what we're going to do for the rest of today, we're going to together walk through a procedure. And my goal is that you walk out of here with a procedure that you can use in your district to fine-tune, adjust, or create your own emergency plan. So let's define what's a crisis. A crisis is anything that overwhelms what you've got on hand. If you come to work tomorrow morning and all the windshields in all your buses have been blown out by a microburst, is that a crisis? Yeah, because you don't have enough spares to cover that. And even if your mechanics do change class themselves, they can't replace them all. And if you have one jobber, most of you just have one jobber handling that, right? Can Mel's Glass come out and change 35 windshields so you can still get the route started on time? No. So if it's overwhelming, it's a crisis. If it catches you unprepared, in other words, you hadn't even thought about that, that makes it a crisis. Something that disrupts your regular routine. So you're going to say, well, that's every day. Yeah, I was waiting for it, all right? How many of you have a regular day that's scheduled? You know exactly what's going to happen at 9:35 tomorrow morning. You know exactly what's going to happen at 9:45 and again at 10 o'clock, right? The only thing you can count on is the superintendent calling at 12 saying, what the heck happened in your office this morning, right? So if it disrupts your regular routine, so here's where we have to be careful. As a supervisor, some of the things that you think are regular are not. It's crisis management. You folks do minor miracles every hour. Some of those actually qualify as crisis events. You've just gotten so good and so used to doing them that they feel routine. So here's the question I ask you. If you're in Columbus, sitting in a class at OSBA, and one of those things happens that you can just roll off without breaking a sweat, who'd you leave behind that can solve that for you? And will they solve it the way you wanted it solved? Right? If so, then that means you had a plan in place, which is where we're going with this. Something that requires your complete attention. So here's what I want you to think about. You have a bus wreck, and you're the only one in the office. You don't have a secretary, or your secretary didn't call in, all the other drivers are gone, the mechanics are out subbing on routes, so you're all by yourself, and driver calls in, I said I had a bus wreck. Looks like one or two of the kids on the bus might be hurt. Right? So now you don't have one job on the table. The one job is managing the fleet. Now you have a whole new job on the table, right? You got to manage that crash. So if you have to devote your attention to managing the crash, the potential student injuries, how to get another bus and another driver, where does that leave you with respect to the other buses that are still on the road? Or the phone that keeps ringing? Okay. So something that commands your complete attention is a crisis. This one, I don't know how you get around that. Anything and everything you do has been texted 3 minutes after you do it. Or before, yeah. In most cases, if you have children on a bus that wrecks, mom and dad know about the wreck before you do, because they've pulled out their personal communicators and they've told someone. Right? But know that, and this is another reason why we need to have a plan in place, is that something bad happens, if we were ready for it, and then after the fact, when that reporter puts a microphone in your face saying, well, how'd you cope with this? And you say, well, we already had a plan. We thought through this. We knew who was going to do what. So all we did was rolled out the plan, right? That's preparedness. That's reassuring to parents. And then this is that ostrich thing. If we ignore it, will it get worse? Or will it solve itself? Right? So all those things are crises. So if you ask yourself those questions about a potential problem, and any one of those might be true, that's something that should be in your emergency plan. So pre-planning is an accepted practice. It's been used in our country for a lot of years. Started with the Forest Service for dealing with major wildfires. Fire departments do pre-planning, Red Cross, any well-run public event has got a notebook somewhere with plans saying, well, here's what happens if, and those just get rolled out. Here's the goals of a pre-plan. You need to be aware of potential complications. You need to have a reaction and a coping plan for each potential crisis. You need to know where to get help. So, let's dwell on that for just a second. Probably if you have a bus broken down, you have the tow truck phone number memorized, right? Or you just pick up the intercom to the garage and say, Russ, we need to hook a bus and drag it in. And Russ knows the number and he calls his buddies over there and they hook the bus and they bring it in, right? But if Russ is not there and I don't know the number, who do I call? Right, so now I'm going to waste time looking up phone book or looking up an old invoice, call the treasurer's office, say, hey, you remember when we towed this bus in? Who did that? Right? Need to have that stuff at hand. You need an action plan that works well with or without you. Any plan has to be written or else it's not a plan. And you have to practice it. So here's the thing about plans. They have to be practiced. Fire departments practice things all the time. Hospitals practice all the time. Airports practice all the time. So can we. I will tell you that your emergency plans, once you get them developed, make great in-service trainings for drivers. Drivers love hands-on events. If you can get the fire department involved and roll over a bus and get some drivers to volunteer to be injured and bring in some nurses to do moulage and dress them up, it's just like MASH, right? And everybody loves it. It's memorable. But it also helps you to figure out how well your staff have been trained and how well your plan works. All right. Who should be at the table with you when you plan? So who's important? Are school bus drivers important as part of the emergency plan? Why? They got a major role in whatever happens, right? And I think it's very important that when you do your planning that you have some drivers at the table with you so that they understand what their role is. Right? How about students? More importantly, how about their parents? So here's what we're doing right now. We're trying to figure out who should be in the room with you when you do your emergency planning. You want parents in the room with you so that they understand your thought process, so that they know you're thinking this through. Right? And then they're going to help convey the word out to the public that, you know what, Pickwa's got it together. Right? They've got a plan for all these kinds of things, stuff that we never thought of. Right? So that's PR. How about the administration? Do you want the superintendent in the room with you? Maybe not. Do you want someone else in the room with you from the administration? Sure you do. If you report to the superintendent, then the superintendent should be in there. Right? I would say to you, absolutely, if you have a business manager, have them in a room. How about some building Pretty important. How about EMS? Do you want the folks from the ambulances in the room with you when you plan? Yeah. So let me, during my career at Princeton, we had a case, and the layout of our campus was the bus garage sat right behind the middle school, so it really is the same campus. At the end of the bus garage, we had 3 in-ground tanks, all 10,000-gallon tanks. And so one of the jobbers came in to drop fuel one morning, and it was one of these days when we had a temperature inversion, and so fumes wouldn't rise. And so that driver, when tanker drivers drop fuel, it's not only a matter of dropping fuel in the ground, but they're supposed to have a vapor recovery hose hooked up also. so that when you displace the vapors in the tank, they get sucked back into the truck. Well, this driver didn't do that, right? He just dropped the fuel. And because it was a temperature inversion, the fumes stayed low. And they got sucked into the univents at our middle school. And the next thing I knew, because I'm sitting in my office back there, as I hear sirens going off, my plectron was going off because my department got dispatched. They had students by the hordes in the middle school going to the nurse's office saying they didn't feel well because they had inhaled fuel fumes. And so the county that day, first responder got in there and said, we need about 15 more ambulances. And so the county stripped ambulances from every other department and sent them into our middle school. And there was a parade of ambulances through the front circle for the next hour and a half, taking all these kids to the hospital. So here's a case where there was no pre-plan. The school district had an emergency plan of its own. And by the way, every one of your districts has an emergency plan. Some of those may include transportation, many do not. And so the school district had its own plan, but it didn't interact with the community. So EMS got called out on what was a legitimate call out and realized that first responder got in and said, okay, I need more resources. This is a crisis. I got more kids than I can fit in our 3 squads from our department, so we need help. So I called the county. County rolled out their emergency response protocol, and we got this parade of ambulances coming into the building. Well, not too long after that, we got to thinking, well, what would happen if there's a bus crash in this community and there were 10 kids hurt on a bus? Would we go through this exercise all over again, bringing in 10 squads? And so we worked, and our district had a great emergency response plan, but it didn't include transportation. So in the transportation department, when we brought in EMS response units, we had 7 communities. We brought in the officers from the 7 communities, and we sat and we talked through bus crashes. And we said, listen, can we have a coordinated response plan? And I had an in, because I was a deputy chief in one of the departments there. And they said, well, we've never been interested in talking to the schools before. We do our thing, you do yours. But since you're one of the EMS guys around here, what do you have in mind? So what we said was, you know, if I have a bus that crashes and there's some students hurt, we're going to call 911, and you're going to respond. Because I'm not wearing my hard hat or my medic coat, right? I'm now a transportation dude. And my primary role is for my employer. Your primary role is to see who's hurt and how to make it better. But I said, let's talk about what happens if there's 10 kids hurt on that bus. So what are you going to do? You're going to roll out 10 ambulances? Well, if they're emergent, yeah. But here's the thing about especially middle school kids. If you put one C-collar on one student in the bus, the other 35 need one too. That's just, and it's not only middle school kids, I pick on them, but it's true with all of them. So here's what we said in a joint task force. We said, if we have a bus crash, you roll a squad. Anybody who's emergent, you get them out of there. But if the other kids are concerned and saying they want help, we'll send a driver and that bus and those kids to any hospital you want to go. You put a medic on board, you put a chase ambulance right behind them, something happens on the way, we'll stop the bus, we'll transfer the kid, you do what you need to do. But instead of you having to call the county and ask for 10 more ambulances, we'll take the bus. And we'll go wherever you want to go. And so now what we have is a coordinated emergency response plan that works well for the community, worked great for the district, because when that happens, we knew exactly where the kids were. And so when moms and dads started calling, we could say, well, we took them to Mercy Fairfield, right? And if you want to pick up your child there, that's where you go. So coordinating with EMS is a great thing. Same thing with fire. And the same thing with other schools around you, because if something happens in your district, it does affect the district next to you. And if something happens to them, you're going to be one of the first ones saying, how can I help? because that's what we do. So all these folks need to be in the room with you when you do your planning. So here's the general process, and we're going to invoke it. Team approach, those are the stakeholders. Then the very next thing we do is brainstorming. When we brainstorm, there's no screening allowed. So if somebody comes up with a potential problem that you think is just wacky, don't laugh at them. You put it on the wall. You say, put it on the list. And so we don't screen. And so the first thing we do is brainstorming with no screening, and we're going to consider all possible ideas. Now, we're going to break into 4 groups. And just so that I can limit the scope a little bit, each one of our groups is going to have a focus. And so we're going to do this in the 4 corners of the room. All right, so this group here, I want you to brainstorm problems that can happen on one bus. Okay? Something that can happen on one bus. All right, this group here, your problem is fleet-based. So, just an example, a problem for one bus could be a fight, right? A problem for the fleet could be Pete forgot to order fuel and the pumps are dry. This group over here, your problem affects the district. So let's see, an example of a district problem. Here, you get to be the writer. A district problem would be, we have a flu outbreak. And the superintendent wants you to get all the buses to school at noon to get all the kids home, but half your drivers have the flu too. And then you guys are community. So a community problem could be tornado, road closure, riots. All right. So let's see what you can throw up on the wall and sticks there. Here's the next step in the process. I didn't say when you could go to lunch. I just said we had to do this first. So what we've done here is you've done a good job of brainstorming. And actually in walking around the room, and you'll notice this later also, sometimes the same problem is on multiple boards. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. So we've built this elephant, right? And if we're doing this in a district, we'd probably spend more time on this, but I really just want to illustrate the process here. So this elephant is all these things up here that we brainstormed. So the next thing to do is looking just at your chart. Are some of those problems really the same? Are they so similar that they're really the same problem? And so look for just a minute and see if you could maybe get your 24 down to 20. Are there a couple things that are so close that you could group them? So each one of you do that on your chart and see if there's a couple things that are very close. So you guys have already done that. You've grouped a whole bunch of stuff into lockdown. So you're ahead of the game. Are some of the other things very similar?
They could probably all go under other transaction incidents. Like we're saying in railroad derailment, it's going to lock you down.
Yeah.
So, I mean, some of that stuff could go into that.
That would be under that.
So you actually don't have to do what we're doing right now because you've done a nice job of grouping, right? So that was smart. Now, that said,
think you can add other a lot of that into that too.
Uh-huh. And some of your stuff is actually going to be over there in that school district side too, because that's really community-based.
Yeah,
Right.
community is the
Yeah.
a police chase going through Utica, which has happened, that locks down a school.
Yep.
That didn't start at the school, it started at the community.
All right, I'm going to stop you there because I think you know what I want here. And our goal is that we group things because here's what I want you to think. Our target at the end of this process is to come up with a list of things that we have to plan for. We could plan for everything on every chart, but then we would be planning out the wazoo.